Have you ever had that moment when everything you've built crumbles in a single sentence? When years of dedication get swept aside with casual brutality? I'm Laura Jameson, and 3 months ago, I thought I knew my place at Gray Enterprises. I was wrong. It started on a Tuesday morning that felt like any other. Coffee in my favorite mug, the ceramic one my daughter made in art class, painted with wonky flowers and world's best mom in purple crayon. I was reviewing quarterly reports, preparing for the client presentation I'd been crafting for weeks. The Morrison account alone represented 18 months of relationship building, late-night strategy sessions, and carefully orchestrated trust. Then my boss, Carl Hoffman, strutted into my office with that smirk I'd grown to dread. "Laura, we're making some changes," he announced, not bothering to sit down. His cologne was overpowering, some expensive brand he'd probably researched to project authority. "I'm reassigning your portfolio to Danny." Danny. The new hire who'd been with us exactly 4 months. The same Danny who last week asked me how to format a pivot table and whether clients expected thank you emails after meetings. "He's more dynamic than you," Carl continued, his chest puffing with pride at his own decision. "Fresh perspective, you know? Sometimes experience becomes stagnation." The words hit like ice water. Dynamic. Stagnation. Let me paint you the fuller picture of what Carl was so casually dismantling. 7 years ago, I'd started at Gray Enterprises as a junior account coordinator, fresh from my MBA, eager to prove myself in corporate consulting. Back then, the company was struggling, revenues declining, client retention at an all-time low, leadership turnover creating chaos in every department. I threw myself into the work with the intensity only desperation can fuel. 60-hour weeks became my norm. I learned every client's business model, memorized their key performance indicators, understood their industry challenges better than some of their own employees. The Ashford manufacturing deal was my first major victory. A struggling textile company on the verge of bankruptcy, written off by 2 previous account managers as unsalvageable. I spent 3 months analyzing their supply chain inefficiencies, identifying cost reduction opportunities they'd overlooked, and crafting a restructuring proposal that eventually saved them $2.3 million annually. Carl wasn't even my supervisor then, he was lateral to me in a different department, handling much smaller accounts with minimal complexity. But success breeds scrutiny, and scrutiny breeds politics. When I landed the Westbridge Logistics contract, a 7-figure deal that required 18 months of cultivation and competitor analysis, suddenly everyone wanted credit. Carl, who'd been promoted to senior management 6 months earlier, started attending my client meetings uninvited, offering his strategic oversight. Have you ever watched someone take credit for your work in real time? It's like being erased while you're still in the room. The Morrison account became my masterpiece. A multinational corporation looking to streamline their European operations, requiring intricate knowledge of international tax law, cultural business practices, and regulatory compliance across 6 countries. I spent weekends learning German business etiquette, memorizing French corporate structures, understanding Netherlands tax incentives. Carl contributed exactly 2 emails to that 18-month process. Both were scheduling confirmations. Yet somehow, in company presentations, it became our successful Morrison integration and the team's innovative approach. I could have argued. Could have listed my 7 years of consistent performance, the clients I'd secured, the revenue I'd generated. Could have mentioned the late nights, the weekends, the family dinners I'd missed to make Gray Enterprises profitable. Instead, I nodded. Smiled politely. Said I'd begin the transition immediately. Carl seemed almost disappointed by my composure. He'd probably expected tears, pleading, some dramatic display he could later recount to justify his decision. Great attitude, Laura. This is why you're such a team player. Team player. The professional equivalent of nice personality on a dating profile. But here's what Carl didn't know, what he couldn't have known, because he'd never bothered to understand how I actually worked. My success wasn't just about spreadsheets and presentations. It was about relationships. Mrs. Patterson at Morrison Industries, who trusted me enough to share her concerns about internal resistance to change. Klaus Weber at Westbridge, who'd specifically requested that I handle all German subsidiary negotiations because I'd taken the time to learn about Bavarian business customs. These weren't just professional contacts. They were human connections built on mutual respect, cultural understanding, and consistent reliability. Danny had energy, enthusiasm, and an MBA from a prestigious school. What he lacked was the institutional knowledge I'd spent 7 years accumulating. The informal networks. The unwritten rules. The subtle interpersonal dynamics that determine whether deals succeed or fail. I walked away calmly that day, my mind already shifting into survival mode. 24 hours to transfer 7 years of relationships, processes, and institutional knowledge to someone who still asked where we kept the printer paper. That evening, I sat in my kitchen while my daughter Sophie worked on homework at our small dining table. She looked up from her math problems, sensing my distraction. "Mom, you seem sad. Did something happen at work? How do you explain workplace politics to a 10-year-old? How do you describe the feeling of being professionally discarded without sounding bitter?" "Sometimes grown-ups make decisions that don't make sense right away," I said, helping her with fractions while my own life felt fractured. "But usually, things work out the way they're supposed to." Sophie nodded seriously. "Like when Mrs. Rodriguez moved me from the advanced reading group because she said I was showing off, but then I got moved back when the other teacher saw my test scores." Children understand fairness instinctively. They know when something is wrong, even if they can't articulate the complexity. "Exactly like that, sweetheart." That first day, I watched Danny fumble through my client files with the confidence only the truly inexperienced possess. He scheduled 3 conflicting meetings, sent a proposal to the wrong company, and somehow managed to delete our shared project folder. 18 months of research and documentation, gone because he thought he was optimizing the file structure. I spent 2 hours recovering the data from backup servers, work Danny never knew had happened. But Carl beamed with satisfaction. "Growing pains," he declared. "Innovation requires risk." Innovation. Another buzzword to justify chaos. Day 2 brought more complications. Danny missed a crucial deadline because he'd confused Eastern and Pacific time zones during a call with our California subsidiary. A simple mistake, but one that delayed contract signatures by a full week. More problematic was his approach to client communication. Where I had learned to adapt my style, formal and detailed with German contacts, more casual and relationship-focused with smaller American companies, Danny used the same energetic, informal tone with everyone. Klaus Weber, our primary contact at Westbridge Logistics, called me directly that afternoon. "Lara, I am confused. This new colleague sends me emails with emoji faces. Is this appropriate American business practice now?" I had to explain that Danny was still learning international protocols while internally cringing at the cultural misstep. "Perhaps you could provide guidance?" Klaus suggested diplomatically. The relationship between Westbridge and Gray Enterprises has always been built on professionalism. Have you ever had to clean up someone else's mistakes while watching them receive credit for your work? It's like being asked to applaud your own replacement while they dismantle everything you've built. A major client called me directly that second day, confused about why their usual contact had suddenly changed without notice. Mrs. Patterson from Morrison Industries sounded genuinely distressed. "Lara, dear, I received the strangest email from someone named Danny. He's proposing changes to our implementation timeline that make no sense given our fiscal year constraints." "Did something happen?" I fielded the call professionally, redirecting them to Danny while quietly fixing the scheduling error he'd created. But Mrs. Patterson's confusion lingered in my mind. She'd trusted me specifically because I understood her company's unique challenges. To her, this sudden change felt like abandonment. "I hope you know how much we've appreciated your attention to detail," she added before hanging up. "It's rare to find consultants who truly understand our business." By day 3, the cracks were showing everywhere. That's when Carl burst into my office, his earlier smugness replaced by panic. "Why is nothing getting done?" he yelled, his face red with frustration. Papers scattered across my desk as he gestured wildly. "The Morrison account is threatening to leave, the quarterly reports are incomplete, and Danny says he needs more time to understand the systems." I looked up from my computer calmly, taking in his disheveled appearance. His expensive cologne couldn't mask the desperation now. Amazing how quickly dynamic becomes overwhelmed, isn't it? "What would you like me to help with?" I asked, my voice steady. For a moment, Carl seemed to deflate. The reality of his decision was crystallizing before his eyes. Danny wasn't just inexperienced, he was drowning. And Carl had thrown him into waters I'd been navigating successfully for years. "I need you to assist with the transition," he stammered. "Just temporarily." Until he gets his footing. Temporarily. Such a convenient word when you need to backtrack without admitting error. Of course, I replied. Though I should mention, I've accepted a position with Hartfield and Associates. My last day is Friday. The silence that followed was profound. Carl's mouth opened and closed like he was searching for words that wouldn't come. You see, while Danny was learning my job, I'd been quietly leveraging 7 years of industry relationships. While Carl was celebrating his dynamic new hire, I was having coffee with competitors who'd been trying to recruit me for months. The conversation with Victoria Hartfield had happened 3 days after my demotion, a lunch meeting I'd arranged under the pretense of industry networking. Victoria, a former Gray Enterprises senior partner who'd started her own firm, had been tracking my career for years. I've been waiting for you to call, she'd said over salad at her favorite downtown restaurant. Your reputation precedes you, Laura. Half our competitors would love to poach you from Gray. She offered me a senior partnership track, a 40% salary increase, and something Carl had never provided, genuine respect for my experience and expertise. I believe in promoting from within, Victoria explained, but only when we have talent worth promoting. You've built something remarkable at Gray. Imagine what you could do with proper support and resources. The decision became obvious. Why fight to keep a position where I was undervalued when I could start fresh somewhere that recognized my worth? You can't leave now, Carl finally managed. We need you. Need. Interesting how quickly you become indispensable when your replacement proves inadequate. I understand this creates challenges, I said, gathering my personal items from my desk. Perhaps Danny's fresh perspective will provide innovative solutions. If you've ever been undervalued at work, you know this feeling. That quiet satisfaction when your worth becomes undeniable at precisely the moment it's too late to matter. The irony wasn't lost on me. Carl had wanted someone more dynamic, more innovative. What he'd gotten was chaos, confused clients, and a resignation letter from the person who'd been holding everything together. But the story doesn't end there. The next few weeks revealed the true scope of what Carl had sacrificed for his preference for dynamism. Klaus Weber at Westbridge called me directly on my personal phone the day after I announced my departure. Lara, is it true you are leaving Gray Enterprises? This is very concerning for our partnership. I explained professionally that transitions were normal in consulting, but Klaus wasn't convinced. You understand our business model. You speak our language. This Danny person. He paused diplomatically, requires much more guidance than we have time to provide. Similar calls came from other major accounts. Mrs. Patterson at Morrison Industries was particularly direct. Lara, dear, we've worked together for 3 years. You know our challenges, our goals, our timeline. Starting over with someone new feels like a step backward. What Carl had failed to understand was that consulting isn't just about analytical skills, it's about trust. And trust isn't transferable between employees like office supplies. My last day at Gray Enterprises was surreal. Colleagues who'd barely acknowledged me suddenly wanted to chat, to express regret about my departure. The administrative staff seemed genuinely upset. I'd always treated them with respect, remembered their birthdays, asked about their families. You were one of the good ones, whispered Margaret from accounting. Management doesn't appreciate people like you until it's too late. Carl avoided me entirely, probably rehearsing explanations for upper management about why everything was falling apart. Danny, to his credit, seemed relieved when I told him about my departure. This job is way more complicated than I expected, he admitted privately. I don't know how you managed all of this alone. How did I manage? 7 years of building relationships, understanding systems, anticipating problems before they became crises. 7 years of being reliable rather than dynamic, experienced rather than fresh. 7 years of being taken for granted until I wasn't there anymore. Walking out of Gray Enterprises for the last time, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years, excitement about Monday morning. At Hartfield and Associates, my new colleagues valued experience. They understood that reliability isn't stagnation, it's mastery. Victoria Hartfield welcomed me personally on my first day, introducing me to the team as the industry veteran we'd been trying to recruit for 2 years. My new office had windows overlooking the harbor. Real windows, not the interior view of the copy machine I'd had at Gray. More importantly, Victoria had already secured my first major client, ironically, a company that had been considering Gray Enterprises but chose us specifically because of my involvement. 3 weeks later, I heard through industry contacts that Gray Enterprises lost the Morrison account. Mrs. Patterson had been patient for exactly 10 days before requesting a meeting with upper management. When they couldn't provide satisfactory answers about maintaining service quality, she exercised the early termination clause I'd helped negotiate into their original contract. Danny had lasted another month before transferring to a different department. They'd hired 2 people to replace what I used to do alone, a senior consultant and a junior analyst, at nearly double my previous salary cost. Klaus Weber's Westbridge Logistics contract was also in jeopardy. The cultural miscommunications had escalated to formal complaints about unprofessional correspondence and lack of industry knowledge. Carl, apparently, was no longer making personnel decisions without committee approval. But perhaps the most satisfying development came 6 months later. Victoria called me into her office with barely contained excitement. "Lara, you'll never guess who just called requesting a consultation meeting." She turned her computer screen toward me. There, in her calendar, was a scheduled appointment with Gray Enterprises. They wanted to discuss strategic partnership opportunities to help manage their struggling client retention rates. The meeting request had come directly from their upper management, bypassing Carl entirely. "They specifically asked for you," Victoria added with a grin. "Apparently, several of their former clients recommended you highly. Sometimes the best revenge isn't dramatic confrontation or public vindication. Sometimes it's simply walking away with grace and watching natural consequences unfold." The irony was perfect. Gray Enterprises, having lost multiple major accounts due to Carl's poor judgment, was now seeking to hire the very person he deemed stagnant to help save their remaining client relationships. I declined the consultation, politely but firmly. Some bridges are better left burned. If you've ever felt overlooked, undervalued, or dismissed at work, remember this: your worth isn't determined by someone else's inability to recognize it. Dynamic is just a buzzword. Reliable is what keeps organizations running. And when they realize what they've lost, make sure you're already somewhere that appreciates what you bring. The full extent of Carl's miscalculation became clear over the following year. What I hadn't mentioned before was the ripple effect my departure created throughout Gray Enterprises' entire client ecosystem. You see, in 7 years of building relationships, I hadn't just managed individual accounts, I'd become the institutional memory of client preferences, industry connections, and cross-referral networks that generated nearly 30% of the company's new business. When Mrs. Patterson at Morrison Industries terminated their contract, she didn't just leave quietly. She contacted 3 other companies in her industry network, companies I'd helped her connect with during various business forums and networking events, and shared her concerns about Gray's declining service quality. Within 6 months, Gray Enterprises had lost not just Morrison, but Blackstone Manufacturing, Alpine Logistics, and Riverside Consulting, all companies that had trusted my recommendations and referrals over the years. The financial impact was staggering. Carl's dynamic decision to replace me had cost the company approximately $3.2 million in annual recurring revenue. But the human cost was equally significant. Margaret from accounting reached out to me 8 months after I left. "Lara, I thought you should know, they've had to let go of 12 people. The revenue loss from client departures was too significant to absorb. 12 jobs. 12 families affected because one manager couldn't recognize competence when it was sitting in his office every day." "Danny actually came to me," Margaret continued quietly. "He asked if I knew how to reach you. He wanted to apologize, said he never realized the scope of what you were managing." The conversation reminded me of something Victoria Hartfield had said during my interview: "The mark of true expertise isn't what you accomplish, it's what falls apart when you're not there to maintain it." Meanwhile, my new role at Hartfield and Associates was flourishing beyond even my optimistic expectations. Victoria had promoted me to senior partner within 8 months, a role that typically required 2 years minimum to achieve. The promotion came after I successfully landed our largest contract to date, a multi-year consulting agreement with Sterling Global, a Fortune 500 company that had specifically requested my involvement after hearing about my work through industry connections. "We've been watching your career trajectory," Sterling's CEO, Angela Foster, explained during our initial meeting. "Your reputation for thorough analysis and cultural sensitivity in international markets is exactly what we need for our European expansion." The Sterling Global contract was worth $8.7 million over 3 years, nearly 3 times larger than any single account I'd managed at Gray Enterprises. More satisfying than the financial success was the recognition. Victoria included me in strategic planning sessions, sought my input on company direction, and publicly credited my contributions during industry conferences. "This is what happens," she told me one afternoon, "when talent is properly supported rather than undermined." But perhaps the most revealing moment came at the annual International Business Consulting Summit, an industry gathering I'd attended for 5 consecutive years while at Gray Enterprises, always as Carl's unnamed support staff, never introduced or acknowledged despite often knowing more about the discussed topics than the presenters. This year, Victoria had registered me as a keynote speaker. My presentation topic: Building Sustainable Client Relationships in Global Markets, Beyond Dynamic Strategies to Dependable Excellence. The irony of the title wasn't accidental. Standing on that stage, looking out at an audience of industry professionals including several former colleagues from Gray Enterprises, I felt a profound sense of vindication, not the bitter kind that comes from proving others wrong, but the peaceful kind that comes from proving yourself right. In the front row sat Klaus Weber from Westbridge Logistics, who'd flown in specifically to attend my session. Next to him was Mrs. Patterson from Morrison Industries, now working with a new consulting firm after her disappointing experience with Gray's transition management. They weren't just attendees, they were case studies in why relationships matter more than resume buzzwords. After my presentation, the networking reception brought unexpected encounters. A young man approached nervously, Danny, looking distinctly uncomfortable in an ill-fitting suit. "Ms. Jameson, I wanted to apologize," he began, his earlier confidence replaced by genuine humility. "I had no idea what I was walking into when Carl gave me your accounts. I thought consulting was just about having good ideas and energy." His honesty was disarming. Have you ever met someone who destroyed your life's work, only to discover they were as much a victim of poor leadership as you were? "I learned a lot from watching how everything fell apart," Danny continued. "Carl never explained that you'd built actual relationships with these people. He made it sound like consulting was just running reports and attending meetings." "What are you doing now?" I asked, genuinely curious. "I'm back in junior analyst work, which is probably where I should have started. But I wanted to thank you. Several people told me how you helped fix my mistakes those first few weeks, even after Carl had, well, even after he'd treated you so poorly." Young Danny had learned what Carl apparently never would: expertise isn't just knowledge, it's the wisdom to apply that knowledge appropriately in complex human situations. The conversation reminded me why I'd never harbored personal animosity toward Danny himself. He'd been a pawn in Carl's misguided power play, thrust into a situation he wasn't prepared for by someone who didn't understand the work well enough to properly prepare him. Later that evening, as the reception was winding down, Victoria approached with a champagne flute and a satisfied smile. "Lara, I have some interesting news. You know that consultation request from Gray Enterprises? The one you declined?" I nodded, curious about her expression. "Well, they've approached us again. This time, they're not looking for strategic partnership, they're looking for an acquisition." The words took a moment to process. "They want to sell?" Upper management apparently convinced the board that their client retention crisis requires drastic measures. They're looking for a firm with established relationships in their target markets to absorb their remaining accounts and staff. The implications were staggering. Gray Enterprises, the company where I'd spent 7 years building my career, where Carl had deemed me stagnant, was now so damaged by leadership failures that they were seeking to be absorbed by a company that valued the very expertise they dismissed. They specifically mentioned that several of their former clients have expressed interest in working with us, Victoria continued. The transition would be smoother if we had someone with institutional knowledge of their systems and relationships. She paused meaningfully. "Someone like you." The offer was both professionally exciting and personally surreal. I would potentially be returning to manage some of the same clients I'd worked with for years, but under leadership that respected rather than undermined my capabilities. "What would you like to do?" Victoria asked. The decision required careful consideration, but the answer was becoming clear. "Let's explore it. But with conditions." Over the following weeks, as acquisition negotiations progressed, I learned more about the internal devastation Carl's management style had created beyond just my departure. The Human Resources Director, Helen Walsh, had documented a pattern of similar decisions: experienced employees dismissed or demoted in favor of less qualified but more politically compliant replacements. The resulting talent drain had created a company culture where institutional knowledge was consistently undervalued until it was too late to retain it. Your situation wasn't isolated, Helen explained during a private conversation. Carl had developed a habit of viewing experienced employees as threats rather than assets. The board is finally recognizing that this approach has been systematically destroying company value. She shared that 3 other senior staff members had left under similar circumstances in the 18 months following my departure, taking their client relationships and specialized knowledge with them to competitors. The pattern became undeniable when we started losing major contracts consistently after personnel changes, Helen continued. The board commissioned an external review, and the findings were damning. The external review had concluded that Gray Enterprises had lost approximately 40% of its market value due to systemic mismanagement of human capital and failure to recognize the strategic importance of relationship-based consulting models. In corporate speak, that meant Carl's approach had nearly destroyed the company. As acquisition discussions continued, one condition became non-negotiable for me: Carl's role would need to be restructured in any merged organization. Not from vindictiveness, but from practical necessity. His management philosophy was fundamentally incompatible with sustainable business success. Victoria supported this position. We can't absorb their client relationships while retaining the management practices that damaged those relationships in the first place. The final acquisition terms reflected this reality. Carl would remain with the merged organization but in a significantly reduced capacity, focusing on internal operations rather than client management or personnel decisions. More satisfying than any personal vindication was the opportunity to reconnect with clients I genuinely missed working with. Mrs. Patterson's enthusiasm when she learned about the acquisition was particularly heartwarming. "Oh, Laura, this is wonderful news. I've been hoping we'd find a way to work together again. The new firm we hired is competent, but they lack your understanding of our industry-specific challenges." Klaus Weber's response was similarly positive. "This merger makes excellent business sense. Hartfield's resources combined with your relationship management expertise creates exactly the service model we prefer." At my daughter Sophie's school concert last month, she performed a solo piece, a violin rendition of "Somewhere Over the Rainbow" that she'd been practicing for months. As I watched her confident performance, I thought about the conversation we'd had that night when Carl demoted me. She'd been right. Sometimes things do work out the way they're supposed to. The merged organization officially launched 3 months ago. I now serve as Director of Client Relations, managing a team that includes several of my former Gray Enterprises colleagues who'd survived the talent exodus. My office overlooks the same harbor view I'd grown to love at Hartfield, but now it's larger, with space for the expanded responsibilities that come with managing integrated client relationships across 2 formerly separate organizations. Carl, true to the acquisition terms, now manages internal administrative processes, important work, but removed from the client-facing decisions that had caused so much damage. Our interactions are professional but minimal, which suits both of us fine. The most meaningful change is cultural. Where Gray Enterprises had fostered competition between employees and devalued institutional knowledge, our merged organization prioritizes collaborative expertise and long-term relationship building. Young professionals like Danny are now properly mentored rather than thrown into complex situations without adequate preparation. Experience is valued alongside innovation, creating an environment where both can flourish appropriately. Your value doesn't decrease based on someone's inability to see it. But sometimes, it takes dramatic consequences to make that value undeniably clear to those who failed to recognize it initially.